want to open your borders, let people in illegally. They want to give them cars. They want to give them driver's licenses. The Democrats want caravans. They like the caravans. A lot of people say, I wonder who started that caravan. I don't think we like sanctuary cities up here. By the way, a lot of people in California don't want them either. They're rioting now.
For statements for lies. That was just a sampling of the president's days-long spree of conspiracy theories and lies centered on illegal border crossings and a caravan of migrants making its way north through Mexico, all part of an apparent last-minute push to rally his base before the midterm elections. And the president took it a step further just in the last hour with a new set of baseless accusations.
You know what you should do, John? Go into the middle of the caravan, take your cameras and search. Okay? Search. No. Take your camera, go into the middle and search. You're going to find MS-13, you're going to find Middle Eastern, you're going to find everything. And guess what? We're not allowing them in our country. We want safety.
Brett, Karine, Nick, and Mike are with us. So here's the deal, Mike Lupica. He's in charge of the borders. He's the president. Republicans control the White House, the Senate, and the House. So Republicans are in charge of everything that happens when it comes to immigration, right?
Nicole, do you think he hates these pictures of the caravans? He loves these pictures of the caravans. Talk about political hay. He wants them to keep marching towards the border right up until Election Day. And once again, the demonization of people who are mostly coming here to escape the lives that they had and looking for a better one, and you go into the middle and you'll find Middle Eastern. Oh, okay. You mean like Middle Eastern people who murdered a Washington Post columnist in cold blood in an embassy in Istanbul that you could apparently walk in and out of like a drive-through at a fast food place? Come on.
There is something, sometimes I wonder how low we've fallen. And you look at Jeb Bush getting drummed out of the Republican primary for calling illegal immigration an act of love, people coming here for a better country. I remember George W. Bush's struggles with his own party when he championed comprehensive immigration reform along the lines of what Ted Kennedy, the late Ted Kennedy and the late John McCain envisioned. And you think about the fact that if they were to enter our country, only then would they become illegal immigrants. Right now, they're migrants. They're not illegal immigrants in this country because not in this country, and some of them are asylum seekers. So they are not what they're being described as. And as Mike Lupica said, they are being watched, this image, and we didn't play it for a reason today, because it is being watched like a hurricane on other networks to drum up fear about illegal. They are not, that is not a picture of illegal immigrants.
Oh, this is a picture of desperate people who want to make better lives for themselves in the United States. Not so dissimilar from the desperate people who were my ancestors who came to this country 120 years ago. Almost anyone, any American has someone like that in their background, and whether they're walking over a border or coming on a ship doesn't make that much difference. I would challenge anyone to find a Middle Eastern terrorist among those people. And by the way, they're a caravan, quote unquote, for their own safety because there are areas of Mexico that are dangerous to go through. But, you mentioned George W. Bush, John McCain. Take it back. George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, a long tradition of Republican leaders who understood that this country was built by immigrants and benefits from immigrants. It's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. We do have to have borders, and we have to have
laws. But he's in charge of the borders.
And he's in charge of them. But we also have a foreign policy that ought to be working with Honduras, ought to be working with El Salvador, other troubled Central American countries to improve their economies, to expand trade, to expand opportunities there, and to have a regularized flow of immigration. Because, by the way, we're an empty country with a negative population or declining demographics, and we could use some more immigrants.
How do you cover the lies in the volume that he churns them out? There's a great piece in the Washington Post Plumline about sort of the impotent rage over the border. Paul Waldman writes it could lead to something drastic. Republicans control every center of power in Washington. So how is it that despite their complete lack of power, Democrats are managing to stop Trump from implementing his terrific immigration plan? The answer is that they aren't. The reason Trump hasn't signed immigration legislation is that he can't get Republicans themselves to agree on a set of reforms. Trump can't even get Republicans to agree to fund a border wall, the centerpiece of his presidential campaign. And actually, let me play just how important the border wall was to his presidential campaign.
We will build a wall Just need it. Walls do work. Walls do work. We are going to build the wall. And yes, we will build the wall. Number one, are you ready? Are you ready? We will build a great wall along the southern border.
Your paper did a great report on how he was a fraud in terms of describing himself as self-made. He's also a fraud as a politician in saying he was going to build a wall. There's no wall.
Look, the president's strategy here, and it's an old one, is to create a sense of threat externally when he can't find one internally. When the GOP is as powerful as it's ever been around the country. And you can fight it with facts, right? The facts are there's actually already a wall on the border, right? There's a fence. If you see B-roll on TV of that fence, there's already a fence there, and that's the point. We have our border. It is pretty well policed. Our border policy is not a disaster. And the people in that caravan, they're 3,000 miles away. And if George Soros wants to get them here by Election Day, you need like 5 747s to do it. It's not going to happen.
It's ludicrous. It is also part of a pattern of dehumanizing some of the most defenseless and voiceless, the people that don't have, I mean, Saudi Arabia has a lobby in Washington, a powerful and effective one. He also, in a leaked memo that your paper reported on this morning, there's a draft policy at the agencies that would really eliminate or redefine out of existence transgender people.
Yeah, which is really disturbing, because now you have transgendered people are probably worrying about their future in this country with Donald Trump now as president. And it is, and this is what he does. He dehumanizes because it riles up his base. And he had said for a long time this was going to be his closing argument for the midterms. Even when we were seeing children being separated from their families at the border, he thought that was wonderful. He thought that was great. And we had heard rumors about, yeah, you know what, I want to go even deeper on immigration. And so after 2 years being in power, having everything, as you just said, Republicans having everything, they don't have anything to sell. Their tax cut is deeply unpopular. They try to take health care away from millions of people, and pre-existing care is really important. He brought up California, how people were taking to the streets in California. I was in California. I canvassed in California 45, which is in very red Orange County, and it is a district that has never been held by a Democrat. They went back as 90 years. They never saw a Democrat. They never had a Democrat there, and now you have Katie Porter, who is being very competitive. And what do they care about? The economy. They care about health care, and they care about oil drilling.
But you're touching on something that's very important, and I'm not hearing it enough on the Democratic side, which is if Democrats are going to win, not just in November, but in 2020, the campaign has to be centered on hope. And too much of the Democratic message is rage. It's relitigation of what happened in 2016. It's speculation on questions to which we do not yet know the answer in terms of the connection with Russia, and that's problematic for the Democrats.
Right, I have to push back on that because, like I said, I just went to California 45 to canvass and be with our members, and I'm going to be going across the country in really important districts. That's not what they're talking about. Nobody mentioned that to me when I was talking to folks, when I was knocking on doors and asking people, if they had voted already, because California is already voting. That's not what they told me. They actually mentioned health care, the environment, and the tax cuts.
But I think maybe you're talking about national Democrats. You're hearing, you're getting a ground truth. You're on the ground with the campaigns. You're talking about a national message coming out of Washington Democrats.
That's exactly right. And right now, you're not really hearing. You're just not really hearing it. I mean, I know it's there. I know their policy papers. I know their plans and so on. But it's not front and center of the Democratic message. And listen, the unemployment rate is the lowest it's been since 1969. I don't hear enough Democrats grappling with that fact. You can make exceptions. You can point out to real weaknesses in the economy. That's a reality Democrats aren't dealing with.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.